Welcome to the Olive Press Podcast, a Mission 1711 production. If there are topics you'd like to hear, please contact us. We hope you'll become a regular listener and share this content with everyone you know.
Hello, friends of Mission 1711. We are so glad to have you join our show once again. Today, we're going to be talking about the resurrection of Christ and the evidence for the resurrection. A lot of times, people really dismiss this idea, especially those outside the church, but even many who are, within the body of Christianity, who are somewhat ashamed. They've come to the point where they want to believe all the good things about Christianity, but they just aren't sure what to do with the resurrection. And we here at Mission 1711 believe that the resurrection is the most central piece. Without the resurrection, you really don't have Christianity because you don't have Christ. You have a man that died. What makes Jesus understandable as being the Christ, the anointed of God, is that he rose. If he didn't rise, then our faith is of no value. And that's exactly what the apostles have taught us, is that our faith rests on the fact of the resurrection. So for this short study, I'm going to be referring to the resurrection, and I may, use the term Easter. I know that will offend some believers because it's really more of a medieval term. It's not an early church term, but we mean the same thing. We mean the resurrection of Christ and the entire body of all the things that happened on the day of that resurrection. So I will not choose to use that word by choice, but it sometimes is just a lapse of thinking because it's the most common term that people use today. The resurrection, the events of that day, they're really not a comfort, but they're a challenge to us. And the reason why is because the skeptical mind, the natural mind, really can't perceive of such a thing being possible. And that's precisely why it's so important. You see, the message is either that this is the supreme fact of all history, or it's a gigantic hoax. If it's a gigantic hoax, folks, there is no reason for any of us to believe it or spend one more minute talking about this man from Nazareth. But if it is true, if the resurrection happened as it's written, if Jesus really did rise and appear to his disciples for many days after the crucifixion, then it is the supreme fact of all history. It indeed is the most important event of all history, and it literally changes everything. Now, in the early days of the church, this was realized. This is something that people understood. It was the one thing that changed everything for those early disciples. You see, on the one hand, there was this little company of men and a handful of women who watched their beloved prophet, their beloved teacher, rabbi, endure this horrible death, the most despicable, torturous death. And they were terrified that may happen to them. You see, they were being accused of leading an insurrection. And if you know anything about history, Romans really took the idea of insurrection very seriously and they punished it harshly. That's where really the whole idea of crucifixion comes in the first place. So, this little company of people turning the world upside down with this message is really quite ludicrous unless there's truth to it. But if there's truth to it, there should be evidence and there should be things we can evaluate to prove that truth. And I think that we can make that case here today. And it's just going to take a little bit of, basic analysis of the situation. You see, these people went out with a passionate proclamation that the greatest miracle of all time had happened and that they'd witnessed it. Now, today in our world, it's a very different world today. We live in a time of electronic media, mass communication. The vast majority of people are educated to some degree. Not so in those days. The level of education of people in those days was just not the same as it is today. Few people read, even fewer people wrote. And the ability for information to be passed around was very limited. And so the idea of writing something for mass media just wasn't done. You wrote for the intellectuals who then read and taught those things to the majority of people. But you also, by doing that, were submitting yourself to scrutiny because the intellectuals of the day would not just read and share just anything. So the idea of putting these things in writing and passing them on, if they were false, is by itself one of the evidences that it's really kind of ludicrous to say that it didn't happen. But we're going to have a lot better things than that to look at. Well, today, in our age, there's a lot of fanaticism today. So the idea that these people could have been fanatics seems somewhat easy to believe. But again, we have to consider what they had just experienced. They watched a man they saw do miracles get executed by the state in a brutal execution. And I have a hard time believing that any of those people would have been motivated to go out and continue his message in any way without having his power. They'd seen his power, and the idea that the state could execute him seemed ludicrous in the first place. But it certainly seemed much easier that they would then suffer the same fate. So why in the world would they go out and begin to pass on this message? So today, those that do talk about the resurrection, who will discuss the Easter message, often are only people who half believe it. To them, it's a beautiful story. It's full of spiritual meanings, but they will often say, and this is among many churchmen, they'll say, why worry about its literal importance? Well, our belief here at Mission 1711 is that if it is not literal, it's not important, especially when it comes to this event. So their attitude misses the point. You see, either the resurrection is infinitely more than a mere beautiful story, or it is infinitely less, totally worthless if it is not true. But if it is true, again, we submit this is the supreme fact of all history. And because it's the supreme fact of all history, it really calls to us to adjust our lives to this implication that this is true, that this is a fact. But if it's not true, again, if Christ has not risen, and this is what the Apostle Paul wrote, then Christianity is a fraud. It's worthless. Our faith is worthless if Christ did not raise. Paul says in his writing to the Corinthians, he says, if Christ was not raised, then neither our preaching nor your faith has any meaning at all. Furthermore, it would mean that we're lying in our witness for God. And we want to consider the fact that these people took God very seriously. At the point they're writing these accounts for us in the Gospels and the letters that are part of the New Testament, they are people who are taking God exceedingly seriously. So by that fact alone, it's really vital for us to decide, can we trust this account, this story of the resurrection? Is the resurrection of Jesus Christ true or false? And then we have to ask ourselves, how can we do that? We have to sift through evidence of an event that happened over 1900 years ago. Really, at this point, it's nearly 2,000 years since Christ was risen. So finding the data is not quite as easy as it might seem, but we can take the evidence that's given to us and we can compare it, right? And there's a couple of different methods available. Number one, we can examine the historical evidence. And number two, we can apply the test of experience. You see, historical evidence is examined to determine whether or not it is contemporary, honest, and convincing, meaning contemporary to the time that it's supposed to be, or if it's susceptible to any naturalistic interpretation or correction. But experience is tested by verifying the effect of those claims and the resurrection on our own lives and on the lives of countless others. And so in this booklet, we are primarily concerned with the first of these methods, but I think we should also consider the second, and we'll get into that by the end. Now, the first thing is the written testimony. So we have to ask ourselves, what documents give us this story, this resurrection account? Well, there are primary documents that are written testimonies of at least 6 witnesses. The first 4 are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're the writers of the 4 gospel accounts. But we also have Paul and Peter, who wrote and detailed about the resurrection in their letters, which they wrote at a later time. Paul was somewhat later than the resurrection by maybe a decade or 2. Peter's was probably 3 decades later. But they're fairly close in time, and we can prove that by the manuscript evidence. We often fail to realize the strides that modern research has made in determining the date and authorship of these written records. In the past, in the before the 20th century, there were many people who began to go into what was considered scholarship, to take lengths to prove that the Gospels were written far later, not earlier than the second or third century. In fact, there's a whole school of thought that says that the Gospels were all contrived by Constantine and a group of scribes in the fourth century. Now, that's just easily proven false. We know that's not true, so that is just a flat out lie. But it's something that is definitely one of those oddball theories that goes around out there. So, in consideration of these details, we look at the actual evidence, and we can demonstrate pretty easily that this attempt to discredit the Gospels has basically failed. Archaeology and manuscript evidence has just proven it's not true. It's literally been crushed by the weight of positive historical evidence. And that positive historical evidence continues to grow, by the way. Archaeology is really giving to us a wealth of information right now that proves the biblical accounts at many, many levels. But yet these written accounts of Christ's life were recorded extremely early, dates very close to the events themselves. For example, one of the first examples here is that Paul, writing his letter to the Corinthians, his first letter, 1 Corinthians is what it's called in the Bible, he gives a very detailed list of resurrection account instances and appearances of Christ. So there's scarcely a scholar out there who doubts the genuineness of 1 Corinthians. And the date is essentially agreed on as being 56 AD when Paul wrote this. So that puts this account within just over a decade of the events happening. And when you talk about the times of antiquity where people memorized facts and details in oral traditions, that's extremely close to the facts. And we know that that Paul's letter was written that close. There are some indications that probably there could have been writings as early as 49 AD. But Paul mentions that he received these truths about the resurrection. Now, we read in his gospel account that he received many things by direct revelation from Jesus. Jesus appeared to him after he converted to Christianity, and Paul makes the point that he has received much information directly from Jesus this way. However, it's also obvious that Paul's life is changed, and in the early days of his sudden transformation, he is hearing these stories of the resurrection from other believers that he is encountering in those early times. And so if Paul had any doubt about the resurrection, if he was not familiar and aware with it, he would have made comment about that in the letter to the Corinthians. But the thing he doubles down on is that he is asserting absolutely he is a believer in the resurrection. He has no doubt about it. And he challenges that this is really the soft underbelly, as it were, of Christianity, that if the resurrection is not true, then our faith is in vain, as he said. Now, also we have Mark, the Gospel of Mark, which precedes his account of the resurrection with the story of the empty tomb. And it's generally accepted that Mark's Gospel represents the oral teachings of Peter, that Mark got together with Peter and was given all these details by Peter that are in his account. And it's generally accepted that this was written at a very early date. Most scholars today agree that it was written not later than 44 AD, that he has taken a fairly well detailed attempt at recreating the facts of Jesus' life and ministry in a way that really talks about the things Jesus did. He doesn't cover so much what Jesus taught, but what Jesus did. And so Mark has taken time to really detail those things as he's received them from Peter. And Mark obviously talks about the resurrection. In fact, Mark gives some details about the resurrection events that nobody else covers. Now, the third witness we present is Luke. And Luke was not present at the time. By his own account, Luke came to interview people who had been there present in order for him to write down the events to send back to somebody who was a benefactor that was paying him to research what was being taught, by the apostles, and to determine if these things are true and exactly what are the truths of the resurrection and the events surrounding the life and ministry of Jesus. So Luke's gospel adds substantially to our knowledge of the visit of the tomb. And this is really where we get down to, the rubber meets the road. It's the empty tomb that matters. But also he covers the subsequent appearances of Jesus. And he provides the fullest account of the early apostolic preaching, because he not only wrote the Gospel of Luke, but he also wrote the book of Acts. So the Acts of the Apostles are widely accepted today as the genuine composition of Luke, and he is called the beloved physician by the apostles. Sir William Ramsay and others that have shown that was, as they studied the background of this and looked into Luke's account, they've considered him to be remarkably accurate as a historian. Now, some people would say that's not true because they find date errors with Luke, but actually upon closer examination, it's been proven that what were considered to be errors are simply facts that were not understood about those dates at an earlier time. The more we've learned about history, the more we've learned about archaeology, the more we realize that Luke actually was careful to get a very detailed account of these things. So these three by themselves, we select them because they become unbiased critics. They're not people who are presenting themselves as experts, as having been there to see it, but having interviewed others to get the details, right? So we also want to be careful not to, omit the written accounts of Matthew, John, and Peter. Now, Matthew, being a tax collector, was somebody who was trained and gifted with taking shorthand. We now know from archaeological evidence that the tax collectors, the publicans of that day, had to be conversant in multiple languages, but they also had to be able to write, and especially to take shorthand writing, so that they could document what they were doing throughout their day with people as they were collecting taxes. And so we know from Matthew's case, which he presents the longest and most detailed gospel in terms of detailing Jesus' teachings, that he has taken a very careful note of the things that were said and taught. And so, again, he provides a tremendous, reliable body of evidence for us. We also know that in that time, Matthew had to have gone to the temple to collect records from the temple before the temple was destroyed, because he has the detailed genealogies of Jesus going back to David and to Abraham, the patriarch. This is a fact that we have to analyze and say, this is a man who took detailed accounts, who went to the degree of going to the temple to collect these records and make note of them. So then there's John and Peter, who were the two of the four fishermen. Again, we see that these men, though they were not initially learned men, they took time to become learned men and to collect details and present those details for us so that we could trust the veracity of the claims of the resurrection. We look at all of this and we have to understand that this is evidence. These are not things that are contrived, because nothing that they wrote could really have been contrived from the 3rd or 4th century. Most of the details that they include in their writings are things that were not really understood in the 3rd and 4th century, especially not in the Gentile world, especially when we look at things like Matthew's genealogies of Jesus. This provides for us an understanding that this must date from a very early time. It takes us to the very early part of the Christian era, at the middle of the 1st century. So this evidence has to be contemporary, and that brings us to accept it. We have to take account for this and say, hey, there's just way too much evidence showing us that these accounts are reliable, especially the fact that the first three of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are what we call the synoptic or the harmony Gospels, because their details are so closely in line, yet they're different enough that we can see that these men were not trying to contrive something. They were putting the results together as they learned them, and they're all in agreement that the resurrection happened and how it happened. So we take a look at this, and this evidence gives us something to really understand. These are eyewitness recorded accounts that we need to pay attention to. Now, there's a number of different attempts that have been made to undermine these, and we're going to call these under the category of resurrection theories, meaning theories against the resurrection, that the resurrection is not true. We here at Mission 1711 submit that we believe the gospel accounts as they stand, and we stand on that. We adhere to that fully. And here's the key that I think that is really the point that is either the evidence for your faith or the evidence against you. The resurrection compels us to evaluate Christianity very seriously and to evaluate the biblical claims of these things very seriously. Without the resurrection, as I've said, our faith is in vain. If there was no resurrection, there is no reason to believe Jesus. And this is why so many critics work hard to find ways to poke holes and to create these resurrection theories, what I would call false theories, because they're trying to find ways not to have to answer to the compelling question, what do we do with this Jesus, right? They want to ignore him. But what we find is that for those who take it seriously, this is a life-changing thing. It begs us to reorient our lives around this truth, if it's true. So let's take a look at some of these resurrection theories. The first one is that it was a deliberate invention, a contrived myth. We have certainly from antiquity a lot of myths that have been handed down. Some of them seem to indicate a take on things. They're hero stories that are an analysis of things that may have happened in ancient times, but they all make the heroes of the stories victorious, right? The epics are written in a way to demonstrate the greatness and the power of these characters. And what the resurrection does is the opposite. It reveals to us that there's only one power, and that's the power of God. That's the power that rose Christ from the dead. Everybody else in the story, including Jesus himself, becomes a victim of sorts of the power of Rome and the power of the Jewish Sanhedrin, where they are really exercising authority over Jesus and over his disciples in a way that nobody would really want to write. There's just no value to doing it unless the resurrection is true. But let's consider this. Again, the deliberate invention story or theory. And that is to say that, most critics who look at this, they're not taking a serious look at it. So this is not really a credible theory when you look at the evidence. But it's astonishing to me how many of the critics who seem otherwise intelligent will hold to this theory. And I think it's just a convenient way to dismiss the gospel. And I think that really they're not expecting to be challenged on it because they don't think that people who believe the resurrection are intelligent. But many of these, so-called men of science who are atheists will naturally reject it. But also there's a lot of people who are very religious that reject the resurrection as a myth. And again, I find it astonishing because it means they've chosen not to look at evidence. Now, one of the first points of evidence is that there is this massive number of eyewitnesses to Christ after the resurrection. And Paul details this in his letter to the Corinthians, the first letter of Corinthians, which again, written in about 56 AD, in which he details that there are the majority of some 500 original witnesses that are still alive at the time of him writing that letter. Now, that's an easy thing to challenge if you're one of the disciples in Corinth to say, I'm going to go check that out and find out if this is true. And in fact, that's exactly what Luke is doing, right? Luke goes to check out whether or not this claim of the resurrection is true. If they found that it wasn't true, if they found that the people who knew Jesus did not believe in the resurrection, did not claim to see him personally rise from the dead, then Christianity would have been over. It would have died right then. 56 AD would have been the last of it. And we would never have seen the rest of these things written because the word would have gotten around very fast that these men were all just liars and deceivers. But we have to ask ourselves, when we consider this mythology, what is the point of it? Why would somebody contrive this kind of a story where they themselves are not only not the heroes, but they themselves are, demonstrating their weakness, their foolishness, their unbelief, their inability to grasp what Jesus was teaching. And why would anybody want to make themselves the follower of a dead martyr and claim that he was alive if he wasn't? So we have this from Paul in the letter of First Corinthians. And we have to think of, the fact that he is allowing himself to be challenged, but we also have to think of the character of the people who are the named and known witnesses: Peter, John, all of the disciples. We have to consider the fact that these men were out in the world, allowing themselves to be challenged and threatened by the authorities for what they're claiming. You see, they gave the world the highest moral and ethical teaching it's ever known, and they worked very hard to live it, even as their opponents were forced to admit that. The Jewish leadership admit that these men are hard to really just dismiss, because they seem so clear and compelling, articulate, and educated, despite the fact that they're not educated. But it's noted that the education they received was from Jesus. So we have to say, well, a deliberate lie could not really change the character of cowards into heroes. And that's what these men became. They became heroes. They became men devoted to carrying out this message despite the persecution, despite the punishments they endured. How could that have changed if there wasn't a resurrection? Because these men, we have to remember from their own accounts, they were in hiding after Jesus was crucified. They were terrified the Roman authorities or the Jewish authorities would hunt them down and find them. So what would inspire them to have a life of sacrifice if it's going to end in martyrdom? Why would they do that? So you see, we come to see that just doesn't make sense with the idea of a deliberate invention or a total fabrication. The other thing is that psychology teaches us that nothing makes a person more prone to cowardice than a lie which preys on their conscience. And again, we can see that the conscience of these people is, by his death, by his torturous death, their consciences are just eaten alive by that in the first 3 days. So much so that it wasn't the men who went to the tomb. It's the women that are recorded going to the tomb to prepare the body for his final burial. To, what they did in those days, what they mummified the body with spices and herbs and aromatic things to sort of speak of their belief in the afterlife, right? Disillusioned, agonizing cowards don't become people that go out and change the world with this message. They would much more likely have just hidden in secret for the rest of their lives, sought, obscurity. But instead, we see them boldly, not long after Jesus has risen and left, they boldly go out and they're preaching in public. Another term is that gets used is legends. And so the idea is that legends grow over time. And this is one of the more dominant theories, is that there wasn't really a resurrection, but there was a lot of hope for Jesus to return because of his message. And so therefore, legends arose over time and got embellished, and, they became something that was much more than was actually what really happened. But actually, that's not what we see. What we see is the details that are given from early on. The book of Acts details Peter's message, speaking publicly to the priests and the Pharisees and the leaders of the Jewish religion, that he is accusing them of having killed the Son of God, the Lord of glory. He's accusing them of having rejected his message, despite the fact that it was attested by the prophets. So we see that Peter is very early on bringing this very powerful, convicting message fearlessly, very early on. And we see that as the church goes on for the next 10 to 15 years, Peter and his group of apostles with him are being very bold and deliberate in their stand. They're well known to the authorities, and the authorities are trying to figure out ways to silence them. So that legend idea just doesn't really hold any water. An additional reason for rejecting this is, just the suggestion of what's the intrinsic evidence? Well, the stories themselves emphatically contradict the theory. The kind of episodes that legend produces for us are episodes where the heroes, the people that we want to look up to and emulate, have great experiences and exploits and capabilities, and that's just not what happens with the apostles. Their witness is that they are beaten and tortured and attacked and threatened, and their lives are turned upside down by this message, yet they stay faithful to it. So it's also, it's recorded by the other apostles. The reference is that James and the others are faithful to continue to carry this message forward. And we have to ask ourselves, what person who would forge this would depict Christ's first appearance as being to Mary Magdalene? Mary Magdalene was a woman of very low status in the church, really more so in society, but we see that some of the disciples held her in low regard, and especially in society, she was held in low regard. Why would they use Mary Magdalene as the person that Jesus honors by being the first person to see him rise from the dead? That just doesn't fit with the culture of that day. Nobody would do that in that day. You didn't trust the testimony of women in that day. Men believed women were inferior. Men believed women were incapable of speaking the truth in those days. And so why would they go about presenting the first eyewitness as Mary Magdalene? It just doesn't make sense. It seems much more likely that someone would have had Peter or John or one of the other disciples be the first person to see Jesus. So then we read of the story of Jesus walking with a pair of disciples on the road to Emmaus. And again, this story does not make the men look very brilliant. They don't even recognize who Jesus is. They're trying to have a dialogue with somebody that they think is a stranger. And it's not until after he teaches them and breaks bread with them that they realize who he is, and then he disappears. Again, this just doesn't make sense from a standpoint of the legend concept, because legends are written to make the individuals in the story out to be heroes.
Don't miss part 2 of the Resurrection Show at mission1711.com.